COVID-19 is, as best we can tell, almost inarguably now, at least a once-in-a-century pathogen, perhaps even a once-in-a 2 to 3 century pathogen. A pathogen that has created not just a situation, but has created a response that really is unprecedented in its scope. And I think in moments like this, in what we would refer to, I think properly, as epochal moments of epoch or epoch, I think that there are several questions that are begged, and I think that's the reason that we needed to gather on a morning like this, just to pool ourselves around our faith and around our heart, and to inquire specifically how now, as Colson said a few years ago, and as Schaeffer said decades ago, how now shall we live? And more specifically, in a moment like this, the question that's begged is, how now do we respond? How now do we respond internally, and how now do we respond externally? And of course, that isn't just the responsibility of a church. Every sector of our world right now, from nations, governments, educational systems, financial systems, healthcare systems, even something as slight, Ray mentioned earlier, entertainment systems, systems of art. I was listening just yesterday in Nashville to the Friss Center, one of our major centers of art, responding to the crisis and how they could continue to do the work of art in the community in a different way. Every sector of our society is having to ask ourselves, how do we respond to this crisis? Religion, I believe, or I would not have invested my life in it to this point, but religion as a prominent sector of society, I think is one of the most prominent sectors of society, shares that responsibility of asking ourselves, what do we do? So I was walking in this morning. There were folk that were not aware that the service was that was not going to happen this morning in our normal fashion, and they asked me if the service was happening, and I told them no, and they mentioned how strange, I think the word even was crazy, it felt for the door of the church to be locked. And yet, somehow, on a day like this, the response of a locked door feels more loving, actually, Ray, than an open door. And so the question is begged, how do we lock doors and open hearts? And that's not a new question for the Christian church. From the earliest days, the resurrected Christ was having to walk through locked doors and thick walls into dark rooms for disciples who were despondent, forlorn, questioning, not knowing. Their entire world had been upended. And into that dark room, Christ came, extended his hands, pulled back the robe, and said, "Peace to you." So I think religion, as a prominent sector of society, shares the responsibility, perhaps even leads in the responsibility of addressing the matter of how do we respond to this epochal crisis. Religion as a sector, I think, addresses many areas of life, but I think arguably the issues that religion speaks to, perhaps more than any other sector of our society, are the joint matters of meaning and comfort. And I think I would even, as I think about it, I would add to that, maybe this is a subset of meaning, but I think I would add the third matter of duty or personal responsibility, obligation, role, province. We would even call it calling. Religion is that part of society that speaks directly to those matters of meaning, comfort, personal responsibility. By meaning, I simply mean the questions, what is this? And how did this happen? And maybe even for some religious folk, the deeper question of why is this here? There's always this underlying sense that there are currents invisible beyond the visible world that actually have more to do with the strings of the universe than perhaps even those components that are visible. We are insufferable at times meaning makers. We can't live without somehow understanding, being able psychologically to control the impact by giving some sense of systematic explanation to how this has befallen us and why it is here, and perhaps even teleologically or project it out. What will come of all of this? Where did it come from? Where is it going? What do we do with it in the meantime, and why are we here? That is the province of religion. And then perhaps equally, maybe even more for some, religion speaks to the matter of comfort. Are we going to get through this? Religion quells fear. Religion comes into the room in the most unsettled of times, and for Christians follows the role of the one who even with his own wounds speaks peace. Not just peace, but Jesus said, "My peace I leave with you." The question on a lot of people's minds today is, how are we going to get through this? How are we going to endure this? And then I think the matter of duty or role or obligation, whatever you want to call it, our work. What is our service in the midst of all of this? What is our part, our province? How do we respond? It was, it seems strange to say, but it was 20 years ago. Can you believe that? 2 decades ago, when Y2K happened to the world. I don't know if you can conjure up all of the feelings, all of the uncertainty, the apocalyptic sense that we had, the empty shelves in grocery stores, the hoarding of toilet paper and macaroni. Y2K. It was a different but a very similar time. It was a time when we were unsettled, a time when we felt like the end of the world may be coming to some sense upon us. I remember at that time I preached a message. I don't know that I would title the message the same today because I've changed theologically and spiritually, but I think there's something to it. I preached a message to the congregation that I was serving at that time, a message that was intended to speak to the issues of meaning and especially comfort and responsibility. And I remember I titled the message Y2K, bug, blessing, or both. And the question that I was offering that day was, is Y2K simply a bug, a burden? Or is Y2K a blessing? Or is Y2K, as most things are, a strange admixture of both thorn and fruit? A strange admixture of cursing and blessing. Like most of life, the yin and the yang, the good and the bad mixed together, the good and the bad in the good. Well, the ultimate realization of that message was I projected that Y2K was indeed the latter, that it was a bit of both, that there were unseemly, uncomfortable, difficult, painful parts to Y2K, but there were also parts of Y2K that if we would distill them and metabolize them spiritually through the lens of Christ, that sinew and muscle and fiber could be added to our spiritual bodies, that we could realize Romans 8, that in the midst of the groaning and the suffering, all things somehow work together for good. All things aren't good, but all things, good and bad, can somehow work together and be made good. I think not just Y2K, but moments like 9/11, major world wars. I think those moments we feel as apocalyptic, or even, to use another religious word, eschatological. Apocalyptic is the sense that the heavens have descended upon the earth, that the spiritual world that transcends the physical, the cosmic world, has broken through the membrane, and we are experiencing something beyond the pale, something beyond the three-dimensional. That's the apocalyptic, when angels and demons invade our space, and the ante is upped. the significance, the gravity of what we're dealing with. As Paul said, we're not wrestling with flesh and blood anymore, but with principalities and powers. That's the apocalyptic moment. Eschatological moments have to do with the end time. And for a lot of religious people, the apocalypse and the eschatological blend together because perhaps the most ominous and for many people the most scary idea is when the heavens descend upon the earth. To summarize, as the book of Revelation said, to put 1 foot of the divine upon soil and 1 foot upon water and say, time shall be no more. It's up. Moments like this for religious folk not only feel apocalyptic, but they also feel eschatological. Crisis moments, which scare us, which unsettle us. And they encourage us, they force us to take pause. I will say over the last couple of decades, my general response to times like this feel less apocalyptic than ever. My response to moments like this, I no longer have a strong sense of the eschatological. I worry less about the Son, S-O-N, coming to the world to stop all things, and more about the Son, S-U-N, coming to its finality. And that doesn't make me less than spiritual, and it doesn't take away my Christianity. It's simply a lens is shifted for me. And in the shifting of that lens, which time fails me to explain all of that, but I've lived a lot of life with you at the Village, and you understand some of that shift, and you've experienced that shift yourself. While these moments are not so much apocalyptic or eschatological for me, they are deeply meaningful, and I think I would use the word sacramental. They are symbolic for me. They're sacramental in much the same way that holidays or holy days are sacramental for me. The same way I don't believe the season of Advent and the period of Christmas is the only time of year when I should reflect on the nativity and the bursting in, the incarnation, the coming of Christ into the world. The same way I don't believe that's the moment when I should localize all of my feelings about Christ and the incarnation. The same way that I don't feel like Easter or the season of Lent is the only time I should reflect on the Paschal cycle or the death, the burial, and the resurrection, the passion of Jesus. The same way I feel that anniversaries of family and birthdays are not the only days of the year when I should reflect lovingly upon those relationships. I feel the same about moments like this. You see, the heart of sacrament is not to set aside one day or one space of time where we solely and exclusively think about something that is important to the exclusion of that idea the rest of the year. But a holiday or perhaps a birthday or anniversary is when we look at a relationship and say, on this day I am reminded to take charge, to take stock of this relationship every day of the year. Sacraments are not days that we cordon off the holy into a sacrosanct chronological space, but sacramental days are days that we are reminded to wake up the next day and look into the face of that child and celebrate the birth and the life that is that gift of God to us. I think moments like this are moments that interrupt us. Sacraments are not moments to take us into an esoteric or to an esoteric place in the sky or in our mind. Sacramental moments are moments to interrupt us, to remind us of things that we ought to be thinking about every day. So in this apocalyptic, perhaps eschatological for some, the sacramental moment for me and for all of us, I think we have to take pause. I think we have to admit that sometimes our hugs become too short, our I'm sorry's become too late, and our love runs too shallow. These are moments, much like funerals and intensive care units, where we just are forced to take stock. So some thoughts that I've had in the last few hours even, some thoughts that woke me up at 4 o'clock this morning from the centerpiece of my faith, someone named Jesus. Thoughts from my religious perspective or Christianity I'd just like to address with you. few weeks ago, when I first started hearing about COVID-19 and first began to feel, because of COVID-19, or as we called it then, simply the coronavirus, I remember my immediate, uninterrupted response was to not stagger my step, to not slow down, but to immediately, selfishly and narcissistically ask myself, how is this going to impact me? I know what's happening in China, but I'm really more concerned about what's happening in Tennessee. Not to be political, but I was very discouraged a few months ago when I heard a quote from the leader of our country regarding global warming. And in a glib, off-the-cuff statement, his response was concerning the future and the damage that we perhaps are doing to the future of our planet and the generations that will inhabit it at that time. The off-the-cuff, and later it was chalked up to simple joking, but the off-the-cuff statement was, I'm not worried about it because I won't be here. Somehow humans that are yet unborn are unimportant enough that all I have the responsibility to do is just take care of the world that immediately impacts me. And as dastardly a thought and idea as I thought that was coming from the leader of our country, I have to drop the stone that I would throw at him because that was my immediate response internally to coronavirus and COVID-19. I remember even being comforted by the fact, subconsciously comforted by the fact that I heard that this was happening over there, not here. Somehow comforted by the fact that a thickening of the walls of our country and the stoppage of travel could keep an external virus from impacting us, because this wasn't a human virus, this was an Asian virus. We were not responsible for it, so we should not have to pay the price for it. Immediately was comforted by the fact that they said only marginalized communities, those whose systems are already compromised by type 2 diabetes, by pulmonary disease, the aged, those who don't have access to health care. Immediately I was comforted. And for the first few weeks, though I wouldn't have admitted it or articulated it because it sounds as dastardly as the comment that I mentioned our president making earlier, the thoughts did cross my mind and they did provide me a false comfort. And then the response from the different sectors came. And the response was a very human response, and it was acknowledgement that maybe this did start somewhere else. And maybe this will not immediately impact you. But the reality is you can be a carrier of this illness without it impacting you. And you can kill other people by your indifference. And simply because you escape unscathed, have you escaped unscathed? Or has your soul been marred, if not your lungs, by your indifference? The word that was used again and again and again was the vulnerable. And as I begin over the last few weeks to watch our society eventually slow down, and the people who were poo-pooing this and saying it's not that big of a deal and it's not unlike any other situation we've had, more people die from the flu than this one, tone-deaf statements that we were making, we begin to slow down and take pause. We begin to become more human as we realized how selfish those ideas were. We went from flippantly asking the question of Cain, am I my brother's keeper? To recognizing that we were indeed our brother's and our sister's keeper. That we had an incumbency, a responsibility to, in our unscathed, perhaps, position, care for those who are vulnerable. I love the sports sector. It's a big part of my life, always has been. I've been moved the last few days, and some people could say it's not enough, but I'm moved by young athletes now setting aside hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own salary to take care of the service attendants, the vendors who operate in the facilities where they play. I've always loved sports, but I think I love even more those athletes who are saying, you know what, our millions are probably going to get us through. But there are people here who live paycheck to paycheck, who make this place and the ambiance and the fans' life so much better. And watching people like Blake Griffin and others set aside hundreds of thousands of dollars, even some of the young players like Giannis setting aside money. Is there a more Christian idea than this idea of getting outside of our own immediate impact, our own immediate consequence, and thinking about the vulnerable? I don't know that in my distilled 52-year-old faith, I don't know that there's a scripture I quote more often because it's the most meaningful to me, and I think if it were the only scripture in the Bible would be thick enough for me. But it's Matthew 25 where Jesus says, okay, you want an eschatological moment, you want an end-of-time moment, you want a scenario that brings with it all of the pathos of a summation, a coming of all time to one moment, one point. Okay, Jesus said, I'll give you that. One day when I sit on the throne and judge the good and the bad, this is what I'm going to say. I, God, was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty. I mean, what could Jesus have said that would have been more poignant and pointed to this idea of caring for the vulnerable? Jesus didn't just get up and say, you know what, I really appreciated it when you cared for your fellow human being. But Jesus said, you want true Christology? You want to really talk about theism and where it exists, where God exists in the created world? It's not in houses of worship. It's in people. But more than that, Jesus upped the ante by saying that the presence of God is most manifest, not in religious elements like pieces of bread and cups of wine, though those things are beautiful. It was what Rachel was saying earlier in the song. Real worship isn't hands lifted in a building. That's like the celebration of true worship. True worship, true theology, true Christology, finding God in the world isn't just finding God in other humans, matter of fact. But Jesus more specifically said, you really want to find the epicenter of the divine in this universe? Hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, prisoner, sick, the vulnerable, the underserved, the suffering. The ultimate sacrament and manifestation of whatever and whoever God is in suffering, vulnerable people. And to listen to sectors of sport and art and entertainment and education and healthcare and government and nations, to hear all of these sectors now, it almost sounds, to Rachel's point, it almost sounds worshipful hearing what we've called secular sectors speak to this word or this phrase, the vulnerable. Jesus said, as much as you did or as much as you didn't do to the least of these, not the most of these, but to the least of these. Most of us, if we're not careful, spend our life trying to position ourselves properly to the most of these. The climbing of ladders, the making of money, the positioning of ourselves politically to be advantaged in this world. We make our way up in life by positioning ourselves properly against the most of these, finding people of influence. It's not about what you know, it's who you know. All of that is the relationship of humanity with the most of these. Jesus said, ultimately, your soul will be defined by how you position yourself in relation to the least of these. No wonder Jesus said, if you really want the kingdom, you begin to learn that it's a kingdom of inverse ideas, that up is down and down is up and first is last and last is first and exalted is abased and abased is exalted. And foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head to rest. And when God breaks into the world, The spotlight doesn't shine on the throne in Rome. The spotlight shines. The star, the cosmic spotlight of stars shine down upon a cave and a crib where animals ate, and God lies incarnate and vulnerable and cold. So what an opportunity with churches shut down this morning. COVID-19 sets all of the world's attention upon the vulnerable. The possibilities facing healthy 52-year-olds like myself, the possibilities facing those who have privilege, the possibilities facing us are slight today. There's much about my life that is vouchsafed in every way. But as this pathogen infects our world, entire population of those who are suffering from homelessness and lack of health care, entire populations of elderly people who still occupy as important a space in this world, perhaps more so than even the young, or at least equivalent to. I mean, what happens when this hits an area in Syria on the border between them and between that nation and Turkey? What happens when this washes through? When something that to me will probably be no more invasive than a sniffle or a common cold, when it attacks a place where 3-year-olds and 7-year-olds huddle in homes where their parents are burning their clothes to keep them from freezing to death. What happens when my sniffle comes into their tent? Honestly, moments like Y2K and COVID-19, it seems sacrilegious to say that they are in any way blessing, and so I would refrain from doing that because I don't believe God sends these moments to bless us. But if there is a God, which I believe there is, surely the question of that God is not, why have I sent this to the world? But in a world where these things happen, in a world where these viruses, as creation groans toward the image of God, with immature groanings and a loss of equilibrium, as it groans with the realities of viruses like this, surely God comes into this and says, I didn't do it, but in a world where these things happen, what can we do with it now? Finally, just a couple of other quick ideas. I think about in moments like this, as I think about the vulnerable, and as I think about the vulnerable really being, for me, the epicenter. If there is any Christianity left, which for me, a more vibrant Christianity than ever, now tends itself around fewer verses. I used to believe many verses very shallowly. Now I believe a couple really deeply and transformatively. But I think about text from my position, from a position of advantage and privilege. I think about texts like Luke 12, where a man of privilege one day looked out at a harvest. And the Bible said in this personal soliloquy, as he was musing to himself, the man looked at a harvest that was so bountiful and so privileged and so fortunate. He looked out at the harvest and he said, you know what? This is a harvest beyond all harvest. It is a harvest so great that I don't have barns or silos big enough to contain it. Think about this. And Jesus said this man was left with a huge, talk about epical, talk about apocalyptic, deeply spiritual, pivotal, sacramental moment. This man came to an intersection in his soul, an intersection in his life, maybe one that you won't face 2 or 3 times. And the question was not, what was he going to do with deprivation? What was he going to do with his suffering? The question was, what was he going to do with his prosperity? What was he going to do with his lack of vulnerability? What was he going to do with his abundance? And he looked out and he mused to himself and said, this is crazy. I have so much, I don't have a place to put it. What will I do? The most important question of his life, what will I do with my abundance? What will I do with my unvulnerable position? What will I do with my hands full? And he stepped back and he stroked the chin of his soul. And he said, I know. I will build bigger barns. I will build bigger silos. And I will put it there for 1,000 rainy days that my life, when you extrapolate out, does not portend, it does not predict. I'll put it there for a just in case that I could possibly never live and probably will never live. Another word that we're hearing in the COVID-19 crisis is hoarding. And from a position of abundance and capability, the man said, I tell you what I'm going to do with my abundance. I'm going to hoard it. And I remember reading this totally apocalyptically, eschatologically, when I thought all of life was a test and there was one judgment at the end of time. I no longer believe that. I think it's much deeper than that. I think all of life is not simply a test. I think every day is a judgment. I think judgment begins at the house of God, and we sit in judgment every day. And it is a great disservice theologically to teach people, you get a lot of practice runs here, but just get it right before the end because you got one final. I think every day is a final, because every day is a final for the child who freezes to death in a Syrian refugee camp. Every day is apocalyptic and eschatological for an 82-year-old person with COPD facing this sniffle. The Bible said as the man satisfyingly said, I'm just going to build bigger barns, all of a sudden, eternity clapped its hands and the voice came from the heavens, you fool. You fool. This day, listen to this line, this day your soul is required of you. God, I remember when that used to scare me to death in such an illicit, improper way. I remember when I used to live religiously predictive of a day, one day when God say your soul is required of you, and the end of 30 or 40 or 70 or 90 years here would be replaced with an eternity, and there was this pivotal hinge moment when my soul would be required of me. The reality is, I now believe that every day my soul is required of me. I now believe every day is that moment of judgment when the hands of eternity are clapping and saying, this moment demands of you your soul. And then the question came, this day your soul is required of you. Now who will all of these things belong to? The question was a matter of distribution. The question was a matter of what do we do with abundance. This is a very scant room. Just the people who were putting the service together today are here, and one other person is here, and that's my son, because he drove down to Atlanta with me. But I was thinking this morning, and he'll remember this name, I was thinking about a guy that I coached baseball, Little League Baseball with, and Stan played with his son, a guy named Joe. And Joe is just a wonderful fellow, was a part of our church there in Nashville at Grace Point. But Joe is a few years older than I am. Joe doesn't get out of the house anymore. And I read this on Facebook from Joe yesterday. Joe said, and he's one of the kindest humans I've ever met, but Joe said, friends, as you may or may not know, I have something called pulmonary arterial hypertension, PAH, or PH for short. This is treatable to a certain extent, but it is eventually terminal. A year after that diagnosis, I was also found to have liver disease, which will also eventually progress and be fatal. I am neither eligible for a transplant, liver or lung, due to these diseases. There's no telling now which one develops the quickest. I am not long for this world, but I have found a way to become accepting of this and try to do what I can on a daily basis to live rather than waiting to die. And I've got to tell you, I'm grateful for every day. That being said, why am I writing this post? I'm writing this post because I now exist in a world that I had never thought I would exist in before. I am in a group called the medically vulnerable. And of course, that's a big topic these days given the COVID-19 fears we're looking at. I choose not to spend my days worrying about that, as I rarely get out. I wash my hands constantly already, and I've just learned to be accepting of the uncertainties of life. There's one thing, however, I have to tell you that's been bothering me over the last few days in relation to the coronavirus. Saturday, my wife did our weekly grocery shopping, and to her dismay, she found that all the hand sanitizer was sold out. And I've seen many, many examples of this type of behavior out there. I know it doesn't sound like much to you, but here's how that affects me personally, along with many other folks that are ill, compromised, or elderly. I wear an infusion pump with a tube that goes through my chest and into my heart. It keeps me alive. The pump gets changed every day by my wife, and the dressing gets changed once or twice a week where the tube goes into my chest. Besides washing her hands before each of these events, she also has to use hand sanitizer to fight infection and keep me from becoming even more vulnerable, to keep me from dying. I'm very confident that we will have what we need by the time we run out. At least I hope we will. But the bottom line is, if you're hoarding supplies that someone like myself desperately needs, I'm asking you as a friend, would you please push pause and ask yourself how this behavior affects others? And if your response is proportionate to your needs and the events happening around you. It's a long post, I know, and I don't use Facebook much these days, but I wanted to put this out there. Not really wanting to start a discussion, and I know this doesn't apply to the vast majority out there, but it's something to consider, and I really appreciate you listening. COVID-19, bug, blessing, or both. A few years ago, when my boy was little and his boy was little, two healthy men stood at third base and first base coaching the kids. And if you could have flipped a coin, it would have been the best guess you would have had of which one of us would have had a tube in our chest this morning, which one would be sitting here talking to you. I didn't think too much about hoarding, and I even laughed at how the hand sanitizer was gone. But yesterday, as I read his post, I realized that there are more careful lenses that we should see through. There are more loving lenses that we should see through. And as Ray earlier said so eloquently and appropriately, there's a lot of things that are missing right now, but love isn't. And while social distancing is important, I don't know that social is the right word. Maybe physical distancing is important. The reality is, socially, maybe we need to be closer than ever before. And I haven't talked to Joe in a while, but I feel like going and seeing Joe now. I think the thing I was most struck by his post, beyond just his words, is then I read the comments, hoping to be encouraged, but I was immediately dismayed because the first comment was one of his friends calling him to task and saying, really, honestly, you should have already been stocked up. It was 8 to 9 comments in before somebody said, oops, I'll leave some hand sanitizer on your porch this afternoon. I've got plenty. COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to develop souls. And COVID-19 says, not just to the church, but to millionaire athletes and business owners and governments, this is a great opportunity, not just to be Christian. This is a great opportunity, not just to be Muslim or Buddhist. This is a great opportunity to be human. This is a great opportunity to actually not develop your body, but develop your soul, because today, in this moment, your soul is required of you. So it shouldn't seem strange now as I close this to say this actually should not negatively impact this institution we've called the church. This should be a moment not just for a church to shine, but for us to be set aglow in a way that will last past the apocalyptic, eschatological, sacramental moment and maybe do something akin to changing us for the better. So I love you, Village, and all the folk out there who are a part of this community around our country and around our world. And I miss you. And I wish you were here today. I'm thinking about faces that I would like to see and necks I would like to hug. But in the absence of hugging your neck, I hope we can connect soulishly today and maybe, just maybe, become a little better people and a little better church and a little better country and a little better world. So that's just some of my thoughts. Let's develop souls today. Let me pray. Christ before us, Christ behind us, Christ above and beneath us. Most of all, oh sweet Christ, may you be through us today. Thank you for this place called the Village. Thank you that while physical doors are locked, perhaps just maybe there is compensation for that in our souls and our hearts have become more open. We pray all of this in Christ's name. Amen.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day